Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Ray. Some of you already know me. I'm a colleague of Shannon's in the Department of Philosophy, and she asked me to give a guest lecture on Adorno and Horkheimer and their famous culture industry thesis. Then COVID-19 got in the way, but I thought, well, heck, I've got these slides anyhow. Let's record a little voiceover, and they might still be useful for students in Shannon's class. So let me say a quick hello, but then we'll get started right away on the material. Try to keep the video here as short as possible. So Adorno and Horkheimer came up with this idea, the culture industry thesis, during World War II. They were writing a book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. We'll say a little bit more about that in just a minute. But it's a rather cynical view, of pop culture, especially American popular culture. And in particular, Adorno and Horkheimer take aim at Hollywood films, but also popular forms of music, including jazz music. But their ideas really do extend to our contemporary context as well. At least there are a group of people who think that they extend to our contemporary context. So I think Adorno and Horkheimer would have lots of critical things to say about our contemporary pop culture context and the way that it is technologically mediated. Though, remember, they were writing before even television had become widespread. The television had been invented, but its widespread use after World War II was still a few years away when Adorno and Horkheimer wrote The Dialectic of Enlightenment. So just before we get started, a little bit of background. Adorno and Horkheimer represent a Marxist school of thought called the Frankfurt School. It's literally a kind of organized school, the Frankfurt School for Social Research, that was centered around, you guessed it, Frankfurt, Germany. Though in 1933, with the Nazi seizure of power, almost all of the major luminaries of the Frankfurt School had to go into a kind of intellectual diaspora around the world. Many landed in first France, but then they also would have to leave France, or maybe they went to the UK, and many landed in the United States. Adorno and Horkheimer have a winding path that lands them eventually in Pasadena, California. So keep that in mind when we talk a little bit about the culture industry and Hollywoodism. So the person on the left-hand side of your picture is neither Adorno nor Horkheimer. It's Walter Benjamin, a cultural critic and philosopher who was associated with the Frankfurt School. And Adorno and Horkheimer are building upon Benjamin's work done in the 1930s. In the 1930s, Benjamin wrote a very influential paper about what happens to art in the age of mechanical reproduction. So thinking about the way that industrial reproduction changes art and its impact on us, or the way that we interpret art. So Benjamin argues that traditional art, whether that's a kind of one-off playing of a symphony, or whether that's a particular painting that can't be reproduced exactly alike, that can't be reproduced exactly the way that it is, this piece has a kind of context and an aura. So the idea of aura here means there's something to the piece of work and the way that it's presented to us, in the context it's presented to us, that makes it have a particular kind of meaning for us, and a kind of authenticity for us. And Benjamin argues that some of that context, some of that aura and authenticity is lost when we start mechanically reproducing art, either through, say, audio recordings when it comes to music. So each rendition or each playing of a particular piece of music isn't its own thing. It's not different. We have a recording that will be the same for time immemorial, or at least as long as the medium lasts. And when it comes to visual art in particular, being able to mechanically reproduce a piece of visual art and put it in a bunch of different contexts, this changes the meaning of art. So, think of something like Van Gogh's Starry Night, but now you can have Van Gogh's Starry Night on your mug or on a t-shirt or on multiple different posters. So everyone can have a poster of Starry Night up on their bedroom wall, right? Think of the way that we go to the Imaginist Poster Fair and buy posters that comes by every term. These are instances of mechanically reproduced art that lose some of the aura of the original. So Adorno and Horkheimer, now this is them being pictured, pick up on some of these ideas, but they're not so much concerned about the meaning of art directly or how it impacts our sensorium or issues of aura and authenticity. They're more concerned with the effects of mass production and the standardizing effects on society that come along with a culture of sameness and a culture where the dominant ideas, they're coming at this from a Marxist perspective, so the dominant ideas of a society are those that are controlled by the dominant class interests, those who control the means of production, here industrial production. What happens when those dominant ideas are naturalized and normalized through mass-produced art? So what happens when we move from traditional modes of artistic production to the mass production of art within the culture industry? And here they're using that word industry very consciously when we're talking about Hollywood films, popular music recorded for radio, when Adorno and Horkheimer think to the future and they're very prescient about understanding what television will be, televisual programming dominated by short bits of information scattered through the real purpose of the medium, which is to advertise to viewers. They saw that advertising structure already in play in radio. So we don't have long symphonies or the development of important ideas in music or long-form storytelling or even accurate and carefully processed and delivered news because of the structure of radio and television and the demands of advertising. Everything has to be quick, little 30-second to 3-minute segments is all you get. So the culture industry, by the way, isn't really a standalone essay. It's part of a larger book that Adorno and Horkheimer complete near the end of World War II called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And this is the culmination of their view of what had happened since the Enlightenment of the late 17th to early 19th century, the early and late Enlightenment, which they think had become sort of parasitic upon itself. As leftist intellectuals, they had to flee the Nazi Germany after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933. But they were also, unlike some leftist Western Europeans at the time, they were very critical of Stalin. They saw Stalin as a kind of artificial representation of what Marxism was really supposed to be about, and that his rule had decayed into a kind of terrible authoritarianism. So they stood out amongst many of their leftist compatriots for thinking Stalin was a bad guy. And they also were concerned with some of the cultural changes they saw when they were in England, and in particular in Pasadena, California, when they moved to America. They were very, very worried about Hollywoodism and the idea of a kind of well-developed culture industry to crank out movies and music for the purposes of generating profit. So the book is concerned with an essential tension in Western political and scientific thought. It's really about two parts of the Enlightenment that come to attack one another. So what is the dialectic of enlightenment? Well, you have to understand it in terms of its two arms. The first is political liberalism with its focus on the sacred individual. So the basic political atom of liberal thought from Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Kant, whichever Enlightenment, whichever early Enlightenment or Enlightenment liberal figure you want to focus on, there's this sacred role of the individual in the system. The political system, the legal system is really based on respect for the individual and the individual's rights, rights to life, liberty, and property. So political liberalism was about defending the rights of the individual. On the other arm of the scientific, or on the other arm of the Enlightenment is the scientific revolution. So this is the scientific side of the Enlightenment, where there's a focus on knowledge for the sake of power. Very famously, the 17th century English statesman Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power. This idea that knowledge should lead to some kind of technical control over the environment or over others within one society. And that we don't really think of knowledge purely for the sake of knowledge anymore, but for what it can do for us. The scientific revolution is about the systematic study of nature and the application of scientific principles to get this kind of knowledge and get this kind of control over nature. And as far as Adorno and Horkheimer are concerned, this is problematic because scientific principles are all about efficiency and they promote standardization. This seems to run counter to the kind of respect for the individual that's entrenched in political liberalism. So let's think here about the ways in which the Enlightenment fell through on its promises, degenerating by the time Adorno and Horkheimer are writing these ideas in the during the Second World War in the early 1940s. Enlightenment Europe had seemed to decay into either Nazism, Stalinism, or Hollywoodism. Those are the three isms that it broke down into. So Adorno and Horkheimer saw that Stalinism and Nazism wouldn't last very long. They made predictions about the horrifically violent nature of these regimes, but how quickly they would burn out because of that. So Nazism, of course, Stalinism takes a little bit longer. Soviet authoritarianism takes a little bit longer to burn out, but Nazism burns out rather quickly. The 1,000-year Reich really only lasts about 12 years. But they were much more worried about Hollywoodism. Hollywoodism has this capacity to reproduce itself over and over again. So it might seem weird that leftist intellectuals who had to flee Nazi Germany would be more concerned with Hollywoodism than they were with Nazism, but you really get that when you're reading the chapter called The Culture Industry from The Dialectic of Enlightenment, that there's really a bigger worry here about Hollywoodism. It doesn't show any signs of burning out. It just shows signs of being able to replicate itself over and over again in accordance with its own logic of standardized efficiency. So here, what Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about is a kind of focus on instrumental rationality. We're not going to be critical of the goals of Hollywoodism. Like, the goals are very straightforwardly the production of cultural commodities for the purposes of consumption and profit. What we're going to say is, well, once we have those goals in place, some things clearly make for better profit generation than other things. Some things are just more profitable than other things. When it comes to films, you're going to see particular genres, really things like romantic comedies, action films, horror films, those sorts of things. Largely each member of the genre is the same sort of thing. When it comes to music, quick 3-minute pithy jazz or pop songs, these are the things that are going to make money. Why reinvent the wheel? Go with what works, make some profit. That's the idea driving their concern with Hollywoodism, is that this kind of instrumental rationality focused on efficiency, standardization, and profitability will become parasitic upon liberal ideal. It was always an ideal. It was never fully actualized, but the liberal ideal of the individual. So Adorno and Horkheimer are concerned with what they call pseudo-individuality. We come to define ourselves by the sorts of commodities we consume, and this means that if those commodities are all more or less the same, if they're to quote Adorno and Horkheimer, stamped with sameness, then when we try to define ourselves relative to them, we're really going to be pseudo-individuals. The idea is, of course, you still have some kind of free choice. That's entrenched in our liberal conception of action. But you have a free choice amongst a very limited range of options. So as Adorno once said, you're free to choose whatever you want as long as it's on the menu. And of course, the menu has a restricted range of choice. So what they're arguing here is that individuality is called into question by the rationality of modern standardized production. As producers, we all play basically the same kind of role. We all sell our labor to those who control the means of production to produce some product at the end that those who control the means of production can sell at a profit. And as consumers, we then buy those products ourselves. So we consume these mass-produced goods that have been produced in accordance with the logic of efficiency, the logic of standardization. But because the commodities we consume define us, and they're all the same, then we become the same. Now, the concern here is that this is particularly pronounced when we talk about art. Art was supposed to be the last bastion of free and critical thinking. So artists can represent a world, quite often a troubling world to us, in order for us to become engaged in in order for us to be engaged in some kind of thinking, critical thinking about our current predicament. So quite often art could just be showing us how troubling and fraught the world is. Sometimes the art could be telling us, look, you live in a very dangerous, shitty kind of situation. And when we commodify art itself, we lose our last bastion of critical thinking, of thought-provoking art just goes the way of the dodo. Well, then what do we do? So when art becomes a commodity, this is sort of the last phase where commodification is able then to become, total. There's no way of escaping commodification anymore. Art was once a way of escaping commodification, production and consumption patterns. Now it's a paradigmatic example of industrial production and mass consumption. Okay, so some people like to read Adorno and Horkheimer and say, commodities nowadays, cultural commodities, they really they're not worthwhile because they're just escapism. That's actually the opposite of what Adorno and Horkheimer think. There's no escaping production and consumption anymore in art. Art used to be a kind of imaginative space, a space of dreaming, a space of maybe coming up with a critique of the dominant ideology. Now everything we consume is stamped with those production patterns. In fact, those who produce films don't even try to pretend otherwise. Think of how we measure the value of films. We measure them in their box office yield. We measure songs based on the number of times they're downloaded on iTunes, or the number of times they're clicked on if we think of like YouTube videos or something like that. So really, we're already admitting this is all out in the open. These things are commodities that are measured by the kind of consumption they get within a capitalist framework. So commodities in general have this feature. We see that as standardization takes over a particular kind of commodity, they all become the same. People literally try to define themselves between whether or not they're, Samsung Galaxy users or iPhone users or whatever other kind of phone they might use. These things are basically identical in terms of their function, what Marxists would call their use value, their capacity to satisfy some human need or want. For this case, gathering information or communication, so on and so forth. These devices are identical. But we put so much focus, almost a fetishized focus, on the small, minute differences between them to the point where those become the real differences. But Adorno and Horkheimer say they're hardly different at all. Well, this is also happening with the kind of art we consume. So people will say, well, I don't listen to that kind of music. I listen to this kind of music. Maybe say, I don't listen to hip hop. I listen to popular country music. But if you look at hip hop and popular country music, they're produced in basically the same ways, often produced by the exact same corporate structures, the exact same production teams, the same individual people are working on these productions. All of the products are, tight 2.5 to 3.5 minute long songs that can be easily put on TV commercials, can easily be put on radio, can easily fit into a playlist on whatever medium or platform it is that you like to listen to music on. So we really do see the kind of standardization here. So standardization and mass production and pseudo-individuality aren't just a feature of art, or aren't just a feature of the culture industry and what's happened to art. Really, the culture industry and art is the last place where we see these processes, the fetishization of the small, minute differences, quite often artificially added to commodities, so that we can say, this is ours, that's yours. By the way, I thought that Coke's branding their bottles and cans with specific names, this happened, a few years back, was just a great example of this. Look at how personalized we're making Coca-Cola. You get your own Coke, Laura. You get your own Coke, Dan. You get your own Coke, Chris. And of course, James defines himself as a Diet Coke drinker. He's not like Dan or Laura or Sarah. He drinks Diet Coke. But these are all minute differences. These are basically the exact same commodity. So when Adorno and Horkheimer are talking about the culture industry and the standardization of artistic production within the culture industry, they're making comparisons to an idealized form of art that came before the advent of the culture industry. They refer to it as bourgeois art, and sometimes people think of high art. Their term here, bourgeois art, maps more or less onto the use of a high art versus low art or popular culture. So bourgeois art is the output of a high artistic culture. Bourgeois art is special because it isn't supposed to be profitable. And also, importantly, it's not really supposed to be beautiful, though it can be. As I said before, its primary purpose is to be thought-provoking. It's supposed to do this job of exposing contradictions or tensions in our culture and our politics. It's supposed to unveil for the individual or the group of people listening, the audience, it's supposed to unveil for them some problematic that they need to address. So Adorno and Horkheimer like to think of the last great bourgeois artist as being Picasso. Here is Picasso's Guernica, which is Picasso's cubist representation of the first instance of carpet bombing during a war. The Nazi Luftwaffe wanted to test out their new carpet bombing technologies, or their new capacity for carpet bombing using large bombers before World War II started. So during the Spanish Civil War, they were supporting the fascists and bombed a small town in Guernica named Guernica, which I believe isn't too far away from Barcelona. And here you're seeing Picasso using his cubist, fragmentary cubist style to represent the pure carnage and wreckage of carpet bombing, indiscriminate bombing that killed, Spanish symbols, the horse and the bull, broken bodies, people lying down. You can see one man lying down holding on to a broken sword, representing of course, the machinery of war. On the right-hand side of the picture, you can see a person there set on fire, dying a horrible death. You can see people screaming out in agony and limbs everywhere. This isn't beautiful. I mean, I think it's beautiful, but its purpose isn't to be beautiful. Its purpose is to get you to think about the horrors of war. And it's certainly not there to be entertaining. By the way, to get an idea of the scale of this painting, I think it's about 12 feet high. So you can see it's a massive painting. It's supposed to be dominating as you look at it. You don't quite get that looking at it here as it's reproduced on a slide. When it comes to music, the last great bourgeois artist, according at least to Adorno, was Arnold Schoenberg. So for Adorno, the paradigmatic bourgeois artist was Beethoven. He wrote an entire book on Beethoven. But Schoenberg was the last great representative of bourgeois art. For those of you who don't know Schoenberg, I'm going to get Shannon to put a YouTube link up on Learn to his concerto, piano concerto, Opus 42. This is a great example of atonal composition. After World War I, Schoenberg, prior to World War I, had been a sort of traditional romantic composer. But after World War I, he rethought the rules behind classical composition and started to produce atonal music. If you've never heard atonal music, here will be your introduction. There are some basic ideas behind atonal music. It scraps previous rules for harmony and resolving on melody. You're not allowed to resolve on the cadences the way that we normally have that in traditional music, so you don't ever get a kind of nice resolution. It leaves you feeling rather uneasy, at least if you're like me. You're not allowed to follow roots and thirds or fifths with one another, so that's normally how we think about music going, is you run through scales with a focus on the thirds and the fifths and then resolve on roots. There are rules that say you're just not allowed to do that. Some very restrictive forms of atonal composition even force the composer to use all of the half tones in the scale before returning to a root or a third or a fifth. And this kind of music can be challenging to listen to. It's in many ways unlike the kind of three-minute pop song that we're familiar with. And if you're feeling extra cynical in the mood of Adorno and Horkheimer after listening to that atonal composition, I'll also get Shannon to post a link to the Axis of Awesome. It's an Australian comedy trio, and I think they disbanded maybe a couple of years ago, but they were around from, say around 2000, the mid-2000s, the mid-aughties, to about 2018. And they're quite famous four-chord songs. So they go through all of the songs that are basically formed on the same four-chord structure, exactly the sort of thing Adorno and Horkheimer would have said would be endemic in popular music. If this formula works to sell records, then you're going to see the same formula over and over and over again. So their song, the four-chord song, is pretty wonderful. The three members, Jordan, Lee, and Benny, will sing a number of different songs that follow the same four-chord structure. Just so you know, this video comes before Jordan transitioned. She transitioned from male to female. So if you have any discussions about Axis of Awesome or the four-chord song, let's try to respect her pronouns, her and she. in those discussions. And we'll ask, why do these songs all sound the same? Partially because formula works. Once again, why reinvent the wheel? They're all going to facilitate the movement of capital here. We're going to sell lots of albums if we stick to this kind of music. So go and listen to Schoenberg. Press pause here, go and listen to Schoenberg, and then go and listen to Axis of Awesome and see if you can get a feel for Adorno and Horkheimer's cynicism about the nature of contemporary mass-produced culture industry commodification of art relative to what they would have saw as bourgeois art. After you've done that, of course, we can ask ourselves some questions, some critical questions. Are Adorno and Horkheimer being too pessimistic or too cynical? Surely there seems to be some genuine and thought-provoking art out there. Even entire genres. Think, for example, of early hip-hop or early punk. Now, just as a point of reference when you're thinking about Adorno and Horkheimer, they actually recognize the capacity for there to be some critical art that could be produced at any given point. Their argument was actually that the culture industry, what it will do is it will expand to include these new forms of artistic expression, commodify them, distill them down to a kind of standardized structure, and turn them into profit-generating products. It's hard to look at, for example, what's happened with hip hop or what's happened with punk once we get to pop hip hop and pop punk. That Adorno and Horkheimer maybe have a point there. This ability to expand and incorporate critical voices and find a way of monetizing them and reproducing them over and over again. It's something we've seen with hip hop, with punk, with reggae, with other forms of critical art in the last, say, 40 years or so, 40 or 50 years. Also, one of the things we want to consider is whether or not it's in some ways a good thing that mechanical reproduction has created more democratic art. I mean, you might want to compare, say, the newest Billie Eilish song to Beethoven, and you might want to say, well, look at the Billie Eilish song is kind of formulaic, it's straightforward, she's basically doing stuff that was done in trip hop 25 years ago, what's new here? And look, Beethoven is brilliant, go listen to the Ninth, come on, this is way better. But in a sense, Beethoven was restricted. Very few people got a chance to listen to Beethoven without the capacity to reproduce art. So in some ways, maybe we want to pay a price. Maybe even if we think Billie Eilish is less original or less interesting than Beethoven, certainly it's technologically accessible. I can go listen to Billie Eilish songs for free right now on YouTube. And one other thing we might want to be critical of when we're reading the culture industry is the use of the definite article. Adorno and Horkheimer are very much saying this is the culture industry. But is there really just one culture industry? They were writing in a context where almost all of the films were produced by a small number of Hollywood studios. Almost all recorded music was produced by a small number of, or owned by a small number of record companies. We might have some reason to think in our current technological context that the culture industry is much more fragmentary. Maybe there's a version of the culture industry thesis that could accommodate some of these changes, but we might want to say it's not really the culture industry anymore. There are culture industries. And these culture industries aren't so monolithic as Adorno and Horkheimer claim. But these are just some ideas for the things you might want to think about, things that you might want to discuss with other folks in the class, things that we might want to challenge Adorno and Horkheimer on given that now we're really thinking about an idea that was written over 75 years ago. Maybe things have changed a bit. So thanks for listening. This thing surely went a little over 30 minutes, and I would have liked it to have been a bit shorter, but that's just the way I am. I'm long-winded. So have a good time. It was a real pleasure for me to be able to talk a little bit about Adorno and Horkheimer with you and the culture industry. And I hope you have fun with the rest of your class. Bye.